They say a name loses meaning when whispered through too many mouths. Catherine. A name too soft for the blade that would taste her throat. A name sewn into silk sheets and royal secrets, now soaked in the cold mist that coils around a stone scaffold. There was no storm the morning she died, only the quiet, that kind of damp silence the air holds before it forgets a woman ever lived. She was not born with a crown, but with a scent. Orange blossoms, flesh warmed by youth, the kind of perfume that clings to hallways long after the girl has gone. She did not walk, she drifted, with a smile too eager and eyes too empty. Men did not speak her name. They watched it, as though her body were a secret language. And every step she took rewrote the king's laws of desire. He was old and bleeding from the soul. She was barely more than a child with a ribbon for a mind. He took her like one takes a final drink fast, trembling, desperate to believe it still burned like youth. But youth is cruel. It forgets the weight of crowns and the shape of swords. Catherine played at being queen the way a girl plays dress-up with mirrors, with whispers, with locked doors that always found keys. She did not die when they found the letters, nor when the king's eyes dried into stone. She died the moment she smiled in the wrong corridor, when the court froze, when the wind stopped, when breath forgot how to be drawn in her presence. They say betrayal begins with a kiss, but hers began with music. A dance, a giggle, the kind of sound that does not belong in a palace built from ghosts. And now the scaffold waits, slick with yesterday's frost. Beneath it, the earth holds pieces of women who once believed they could be more than a man's fever dream. The executioner sharpens memory into steel. She will kneel, not for prayer, not for forgiveness, but because it is the last gesture her body will ever make. Her head will fall before the echo does. And still, she will not scream. Catherine Howard was not born into silence, but into softness, a lace-framed blur of forgotten lineage, distant from the throne yet caught in its shadow. She entered the world not like a storm, but like candlelight flickering, fragrant, too easily snuffed. Her name, spoken lightly in parlors and courtyards, was never meant to echo through execution chambers. The fifth wife of Henry VIII was a girl dressed in a woman's illusion, her innocence wound tightly like a velvet noose. To the court, she was laughter sewn into satin, a ripple of perfume that disturbed the heavy air of Tudor austerity. They called her rose-like, as if beauty had ever been safe in this garden of knives. She was not educated in theology or politics, but in glances, in touches, in how long to hold a gaze before letting it drop like a pin on a marble floor. The old men of court smiled too long in her direction, teeth yellowed by power and greed. And Catherine smiled back not out of malice, but because no one had taught her not to. Hers was a world of veils and corridors, where truth wore makeup and betrayal hid in silk sleeves. She lived among women whose bodies had been bartered for lineage, whose voices only mattered if a man repeated them. Even in girlhood, her limbs moved as though waiting to be owned. They said she was raised among the daughters of music, a phrase as delicate as it was damning. For it meant she had learned to entertain, to dance when summoned, to smile when desired. Her earliest lessons were in silence and rhythm, the kind that trains a girl to disappear behind her own beauty. There was no father's voice to warn her of the teeth behind the crown, no mother's fingers to braid caution into her hair. She was raised among mirrors, not walls, and mirrors never protect. They only reflect what men want to see. When she entered court, it was not with ambition, but with aroma, fresh skin, warm laughter, the glimmer of youth too naive to be strategic. She did not plot her ascent, she floated into it, carried by currents of lust and forgetfulness. The king, monstrous and mutilated by time, saw in her not a woman, but the echo of all he once had and all he could no longer possess. He took her hand with the grip of rot and fever, needing her not as a partner but as a painting, a portrait to hang over his decay. Catherine became queen, not with a coronation, but with a consumption consumed by royal hunger, devoured by expectation. She was draped in pearls like shackles, dressed in tapestries of lineage she did not understand. Her youth, once a fragrance, became a wound. The courtiers whispered, they always whispered, that she was too giddy, too soft, too alive. Queens were not meant to glow, they were meant to endure. And Catherine, poor Catherine, glittered like a candle in a room full of damp men. Every time she laughed, a dagger was sharpened. Every time she danced, a rope was braided. Even the queen's throne seemed too large beneath her, as if history itself recoiled from her uncalloused hands. The women who served her watched with pity, curdled by fear, their faces pale with unspoken warnings. They had seen too many girls turn to ghosts. The palace itself conspired against her. Whitehall did not forgive beauty, it embalmed it. The corridors hummed with jealousy and secrets, the walls heavy with the perfume of dead wives. She slept in chambers that once heard screams, walked beneath ceilings that had watched queens crumble. Henry, once a prince, had become a wound in motion. He limped through the halls like a plague that forgot to die. His eyes, once blue with promise, had faded into ice. Catherine kissed his ulcered hands and smiled, always smiled, because she knew nothing else. She played her part with the joy of ignorance, not yet understanding that to be queen in England was to be a lamb in a crown of thorns. There was no sanctuary in titles. Her ladies were spies. Her footsteps were measured, her whispers recorded. And yet she continued radiant, oblivious, twirling through the graveyard of kings as though she could charm the skeletons. She wrote love notes with too much warmth, accepted tokens with too little caution. She did not know that her body was no longer hers. It belonged to a kingdom, a king, a myth. It belonged to the blade that had not yet been forged. In her mind, she was still the girl who danced at Lambeth, still the child who laughed at shadows. But to the world, she was Catherine V, the latest vessel into which the crown poured its poison. Even her moments of solitude were not hers. The fire in her chambers spoke in crackles of past sins. The tapestries watched. Her bed held memories she had not made. She was not alone, even in sleep. Dreams turned to warnings. Her reflection, once her closest confidant, began to flicker. There were days when her face did not look back, nights when her hands trembled for no reason she could name. She began to forget laughter. Her letters lost their rhythm. A weight crept into her voice. The king's presence grew colder, like meat turning beneath the sun. He no longer touched her with longing, only with suspicion. The court followed his gaze. Where once they bowed, now they blinked. The silence in rooms thickened. Her name, once said with awe, now passed through lips like a prayer at a funeral. She heard footsteps outside her chamber too often, doors opened too quickly, eyes lingered too long. Even the mirrors began to distort her, too pale, too tired, too mortal. She wore gowns that no longer fit her joy. She spoke less, smiled less, breathed less. The palace had begun its slow digestion. Catherine's innocence, if it ever existed, was now an accusation. Her past, harmless in youth, became a noose woven from old letters, old glances, old touches. Every boy who once loved her became a ghost summoned to haunt her. The air turned thick with names: Francis Derham, Thomas Culpeper, men she had once known, men who had touched her, men who had left fingerprints on a body now owned by the crown. The whispers turned to murmurs, the murmurs to reports. She had danced, they said. She had kissed, she had laughed too freely. In a court where queens died for less, she had lived too much. Her girlish joys were now treason. Her heart, once a fluttering thing, was now dissected, documented, desecrated. The king did not ask. He glared. He did not accuse. He weighed. And Catherine, in her silk and pearls, began to unravel. The palace that once crowned her now hunted her. Each candle flicker became an omen. Each rustle in the corridor, a footstep closer to doom. She tried to pray, but the words caught in her throat. Her rosary beads slipped from her fingers like blood through cracked glass. She no longer slept. She waited. The shift was imperceptible, like decay beneath velvet. Servants stopped meeting her eyes. Her food arrived colder, her gowns less fresh. Even her jewels seemed dimmer. The queen was no longer a queen. She was a question no one dared answer. The air around her thickened with a kind of mourning that comes before death, when the world begins to forget you even as you still breathe. She wandered through the halls like a ghost rehearsing her final scene. Her fingers trembled when she reached for doorknobs. Her voice grew smaller, tighter, as though speaking too loudly might provoke the walls to collapse. She no longer laughed. The child had faded. In her place stood a woman who had seen the edge of the blade before it was drawn. Yet still, she wore the crown, not because it fit, but because no one had yet taken it away. And perhaps that was the worst cruelty of all, not the scaffold that awaited her, but the slow erosion of meaning, of being named queen and feeling less than a girl, of being surrounded by opulence, yet drowning in dread. Catherine, in the end, was not undone by a man or a moment, but by 1,000 silences that wrapped around her like a shroud. One breath at a time, it began, as all hauntings do, in a whisper, a breath held too long in a chamber too still. Somewhere in the stone belly of Whitehall, a name was spoken, not in rage, not in certainty, but in that quiet tone of bureaucratic death when a court clerk records the first syllable of a downfall. Derham, a man not royal, not important, not dangerous until he was remembered. He had touched her, once, before the crown, and that was enough. The walls had mouths, and they remembered everything. They remembered the night breeze on bare arms, the soft laughter beneath blankets, the ink of a letter signed with love. What had been warmth turned to weapon. The king's men did not search for truth. They searched for blood. Her past was not a history, it was evidence. She had loved someone before the king, and for that, she must pay with screams. They came not with swords, but with parchment and silence, slipping through corridors like shadows without footsteps. Catherine was questioned not by men, but by fate in a clerk's robe. Each inquiry peeled skin from memory. She was not tortured in body, but in memory made to relive her kisses as confessions, her touches as crimes. She could not say she was young. She could not say she was foolish. She could only say what they already knew, or worse, what they wanted to hear. The court curdled. Once silent maids remembered too much. Ladies in waiting became informants. Every moment she had smiled was now pinned beneath a microscope of malice. They unpicked her joy with tweezers, turned her softness into strategy, her laughter into manipulation. Even her music became damning. She had danced too well. They said she had moved like one who knew she was watched. Her grace was no longer innocent. It was dangerous. The queen had known what she was doing, and so they came for her past. Francis Derham, the old flame buried beneath childhood folly, dragged from memory into interrogation. He spoke with bitterness, half shame, half vengeance, not to protect her, but to preserve himself. Men do not burn alone. He told them everything, the kisses, the promise of marriage, the shared rooms, the night sounds, words that once bloomed in private now scrawled on the parchment of damnation. She was no longer a girl. She was a file, a case, a document destined for fire. But it was not enough. The past had wounded her. But the present would drown her, because someone else had touched her more recently, someone closer, someone now. Thomas Culpeper, a man who wore velvet with ease, who smiled with a soldier's precision, who moved through the court like smoke. She had trusted him, perhaps loved him, or perhaps she had simply been lonely, a girl queen married to an aging monster, craving the warmth of a glance not soaked in possession. Their meetings were whispered of but never seen, their notes delicate, foolish. Human became blades. He called her mine. She called him dearest. No bodies were found entwined. No eyes had seen the act. But the implication alone was fatal. The king needed no proof, only poetry. Love, in this court, was the most dangerous conspiracy. Catherine had loved wrong, and that was treason. And so Culpeper, too, was dragged into the ritual. He denied as much as he could. He admitted just enough to die. Their stories bent and cracked under pressure, contradicting, confirming, collapsing. It did not matter. They had already been devoured by the machinery of suspicion. No trial would save them. Only the scaffold awaited, patient and still. Catherine, once the girl who danced, was now the woman who betrayed, or so they said. The king did not rage. He did not scream. He grew quiet, and that was worse. His silence spread like mold, infecting every corner of court. Those who once laughed at Catherine's jokes now flinched when her name was uttered. Her gowns were removed, her crest taken down, her bed stripped. She had not died, yet her presence was erased. The court moved quickly, as if ashamed of ever having celebrated her. The same mouths that called her radiant now called her reckless. The same men who bowed before her now ordered her belongings burned. In the garden, the flowers she loved were uprooted. In the chapel, her name was omitted from prayer. Even God was made to forget her. Meanwhile, the interrogations deepened. Her servants were torn apart by questions. Her letters were studied like sacred blasphemy. Each word twisted, each curve of ink examined like a bruise. They found nothing new, only what they had already decided she was guilty. Not of crime, but of emotion, of feeling in a kingdom that punished the heart. Then came the violence. Quiet at first, a man dragged behind doors, a cry smothered by stone. Then louder, Derham was tortured until his body forgot how to be whole. He confessed, recanted, confessed again. It did not matter. His fate was sealed before the rope was tied. They cut him until his skin was a memory. Then they hanged him, then they quartered him. His limbs were nailed to four corners of London like a compass of horror, a warning sewn in flesh. Culpeper was spared the worst, but only just. His execution was swift, but not clean. The crowd gathered as if for theater. Children watched. Women wept. The sky remained silent. Catherine was not there, but she heard, in her chamber. She felt each blow like a phantom limb. She knew they died because of her, or for her, or through her. She was the axis of their pain, the queen of their ruin. And still she waited, not for forgiveness, not for mercy, but for the knock. The single knock that would signal her name had been carved into stone, and then it came. She was no longer queen. She was prisoner. The title was stripped from her like skin, her jewelry taken, her rings removed, her chambers emptied. She was led through halls that once echoed her laughter, now lined with the footsteps of guards who would not meet her eyes. They brought her to Sion Abbey, a place of prayer, now her cage. The nuns did not touch her. They fed her, but did not comfort her. She was no longer woman nor sinner, she was relic, a cursed icon sealed in silence. The days bled together. She wrote letters the king never read, pleaded to a god who had gone deaf. Her thoughts began to rot. Her hands trembled with prayers she no longer believed. She stopped sleeping. Shadows danced on her walls like cruel jesters. The silence thickened until it pressed on her chest like a hand. They told her nothing, only waited. She was a corpse rehearsing its stillness. Then came the death warrant, signed with ink thick as dried blood, read aloud like scripture. She would die, not in years, not in months, but soon. The date was not given. The hour, uncertain. She awoke each morning not knowing if it would be her last. Time became a cruelty. She could not scream. She could not cry. She simply was like a moth pinned to velvet, wings still fluttering though the needle had pierced. And still, the king said nothing. He had loved her. Once, perhaps. He had kissed her, touched her, claimed her. But now, she was a stain, a reminder of desire gone rancid. He had to erase her to forget his own shame. And so the machine turned. The scaffold was built, the block cleaned, the crowd summoned. Catherine, the girl queen, would die like a criminal. But she was no traitor, only a child in a queen's mask, undone by the oldest sin of all, being too alive in a place that fed on death. She asked for one thing before the end, one last gesture, one final moment to reclaim herself. She asked for the execution block to be brought to her cell, not to delay, not to resist, but to rehearse, to practice, so that when the moment came, she would not tremble, so that when the blade rose, her neck would already know the posture, and they granted it quietly, without ceremony. They carried the block in under torchlight, placed it before her, and Catherine, barefoot and alone, knelt, lowered her head, felt the cold wood press against her skin. She remained there, in that position of surrender, until morning. She had never been more queenly than in that moment of ruin, not because she ruled, but because she accepted what no one else could, that in this kingdom, beauty was treason, and innocence could not survive the gaze of kings. The morning came slowly, as if the sun itself were reluctant to rise over a scaffold soaked in memory. Catherine Howard did not sleep that night. Not truly. She lay in the dim hush of her cell, her body curled like a question mark, eyes wide and fixed on nothing, for nothing remained that could comfort her. The stone walls seemed closer than before, as though the abbey itself wished to press her into silence. The air was cold but unmoving, thick with the scent of burnt tallow and mold, the smell of endings. Somewhere beyond her chamber, preparations were being made. Men whispered in corners, sharpening blades that no longer needed sharpening, adjusting ropes that would never hold her, sweeping snow from the path she would never walk again. There was ceremony in death, but it was not hers. She had become, already, an absence wrapped in skin. When the door creaked open, it did not surprise her. No scream, no gasp, just a blink, a breath, a final letting go of all hope. The guards stepped in, not with cruelty, but with ritual. Even execution has etiquette. They told her it was time. She did not ask for delay. She did not fall to her knees. She merely stood, trembling slightly, and smoothed the folds of her gown, the same gown she had worn the day before, and the day before that. There were no jewels, no embroidery, just fabric, thin and plain, like shroud pretending to be clothing. She walked with the unsteady grace of a girl, forcing her limbs to behave like a woman's. And in that, she became something more tragic than queen or traitor. She became a child made to carry her own coffin. They led her through corridors that once rang with laughter, now silent as tombs. The cold seeped up through the soles of her shoes, crept into her knees, her spine, her throat. But she did not shiver. She held herself as still as the statues in the courtyard, those carved saints who watched but never wept. Outside, The sky hung low and colorless, a sheet of pale ash stretching across the heavens. The scaffold loomed in the courtyard like a wound in the world, surrounded by spectators who had come not to mourn, but to see. Always, they wanted to see. The crowd did not chant or jeer. It stood in a reverent hush, the kind that only comes when horror wears a crown. Catherine climbed the steps alone. No priest, no consort. Only the executioner awaited her, dressed not in robes, but in finality. His blade gleamed with the memory of queens, his eyes hollow with practiced detachment. She turned to him and nodded. Not in submission, but in understanding. They were both trapped in this moment, bound by history's appetite. She knelt slowly, her knees pressing into the damp wood. The cold of the block kissed her chin, her hands clasped in front of her. Not in prayer, but in resolve. She whispered something, soft as breath. No one heard the words. No one ever would. Then, without signal or delay, the blade fell. It was quick, faster than anyone expected. Her body slumped forward with a grace even death could not steal. Her head rolled into straw, eyes wide open, lips parted, as though mid-sentence. Blood pooled like ink, staining the stage of her last performance. The crowd gasped once, then fell into uneasy stillness. A woman sobbed. A child clutched his mother's hand. And then it was done. The executioner lifted her head, showed it to the crowd, then placed it beside her body with the care of one laying down a doll. She was no longer Catherine. She was an ending, a caution, a whisper in stone. Her body was taken, not to a queen's tomb, but to an unmarked grave. No monument, no epitaph, only dirt, dark and wet, to swallow her whole. The court returned to its duties. The king dined. The servants scrubbed blood from wood. The world moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to the final breath of a girl who once danced through corridors like sunlight through smoke. But death is not the end for those who die in silence. Catherine's legacy did not rise in words, but in the echoes she left behind. In every young girl who entered court, wide-eyed and smiling, there was her shadow. In every queen who looked into the mirror and saw more crown than face, there was her memory. She became a ghost sewn into royal fabric. Her name unspoken but deeply felt. Henry, bloated and broken by his own brutality, would never again speak of her. But his silence was louder than any eulogy. In private moments, his eyes lingered on doorways she once entered, paused beside tapestries that once framed her presence. Her perfume, once dismissed as childish sweetness, became a phantom that clung to his throat. He remarried, he ruled, he rotted. But in the hollow chambers of his soul, she remained the girl he tried to make queen, the girl he buried to silence his shame. The court moved on, reshuffling its players, adjusting its lies. But the women remembered. The maids who once dressed her now brushed their own hair in silence, as if afraid joy might summon the scaffold. The ladies who once envied her now avoided mirrors, as if beauty itself were treason. Even the walls held their breath. The corridor where she once laughed grew colder, as if it missed the sound. A tapestry was found one morning torn from its hooks. No explanation, no punishment, only a hush, and eyes that would not meet. Her story was not told. It was hinted, shuddered, passed between lips with trembling reverence. They called her foolish, then saintly, then nothing at all. The king's historians omitted her name where they could, or buried it beneath thicker paragraphs. She had worn the crown, yes, but not long enough to matter. Not long enough to rewrite the sin of being too alive. And yet, her presence haunted the architecture. It became the silence in a queen's prayer, the draft in a girl's chamber, the tear on a pillow no one could explain. Years passed. New queens came. Some survived, some did not. But Catherine remained not in flesh, but in dread. Her name surfaced only when the wind howled, only when a maid cried in her sleep. They said she was seen standing at windows, long sealed shut, walking barefoot through snow, her head still on her shoulders, her eyes pleading but unblinking. She did not scream. She never screamed. Her horror was quieter, more refined, the horror of someone who never meant to die, yet walked straight into death's embrace wearing a smile too wide for her age. Her final words, lost to time, were said to be a wish I die a queen, but no one could agree. Some claimed she begged for mercy, others that she forgave the king, but none knew. None had truly listened. Perhaps her last thought was of music. Perhaps it was of a door opening. Or perhaps it was nothing, the quiet relief of not having to breathe in a world that demanded too much. In the end, her death was not a singular tragedy, but a pattern, a stain on the hem of monarchy, a reminder that England does not remember its women, it devours them. Catherine Howard was not the first girl to be sacrificed on the altar of royal appetite, nor the last, but she was perhaps the purest, not because she was innocent, but because she was unaware. She did not play the game. She merely wandered into it, and for that, the game devoured her. Her legacy is not written in marble or ink, but in the shiver that runs down the spine of every girl who hears her name, a soft name, a pretty name, a name that sounds like petals and prayers, and yet, beneath it, the thrum of steel, the echo of a blade through bone, the hush before a scream that never comes. She is remembered, not as queen, not as traitor, but as myth, a cautionary breath, a flicker in the eye of history. The girl who knelt to practice dying, the girl who did not cry when the end came, the girl who died with her eyes wide open. They buried her in secret. No monument carved, no mourning robe ordered, no cathedral bells allowed to mark the hour. Just a patch of earth too soft to resist and too unworthy to keep her name. Yet the soil remembered, and so did the cold. Every winter, frost blooms early on the stones near her grave, as though the ground still shivers from the memory of her kneeling. She does not haunt the palace in screams or bloodied lace. Her ghost walks differently. She is the whisper behind the closed door, the cold hand in a queen's dream, the breath caught in the throat of a girl standing too close to a king. No one dares speak of her, yet she is in every silence, every tremble, every pause before a girl answers a question too sharp. From a man too old, Catherine Howard did not die screaming. She did not beg. She knelt, practiced, obeyed. Not because she was brave, but because the world had given her no other script. She died exactly as they required, beautiful, ruined, silent, and for that, history shut its mouth. But the shadows did not. They keep her. They sing her in the draught beneath the court's gold doors. They echo her in the ache of every girl who walks too softly, smiles too brightly, is told she is too much and not enough all at once. She was never meant to be remembered, but some deaths are too quiet to forget, and hers still bleeds beneath the crown.